Okay, good afternoon. Let's make a start. Thanks for coming along today. I'm Susan Evans. I'm a Senior Policy Advisor at Green Alliance. And I'd like to start by thanking Suez for hosting this event, but also for bringing the topic of resources and waste to the COP26 week, which I think a lot of us agree has maybe not received the attention that it deserves. Before I introduce our panel today, it has been, I've already reduced it. One person has not been able to attend because of COVID. But yes, so first I'm going to start by just saying a few words about why we need to be talking about resources in the context of the net zero transition. So I think we can all agree that the sort of topics that are on the agenda this week at COP26 are really important. Things like reducing, decarbonising the grid and addressing deforestation. We're not going to dispute that those should be on the agenda, but the topic of resources and resource consumption really has to come up in focus going forward, because if you look at the data on the contribution to global carbon emissions, our consumption of resources accounts for around 50%. And as we actually make all the good progress that will hopefully come out of the COP meetings, decarbonising the grid, it's only going to become more important to look at resources, because it's going to be an even bigger part of our carbon footprint. So if you look at here in Scotland, for example, data from Zero Waste Scotland shows that resource consumption already accounts for perhaps 80% of the carbon footprint. So that's a sort of indicator of what's going to happen in other countries as they decarbonise their grids. So I think as we push to roll out more and more green energy infrastructure and green technologies, it's important to remember that those technologies also have their own material footprint, which means they have the associated carbon impacts and other impacts, very high impacts on biodiversity, nature loss, water scarcity, and other pollution impacts. So thinking about the materials that are involved in making those technologies and building that infrastructure has to be part of the conversation. So one risk that we're going to look at in particular with the panel today is associated with the critical raw materials that are used in lots of green technologies. So critical raw materials are so called because they're critically important to strategic sectors like low carbon technologies, but also because they tend to face supply risks, and that can be because of scarcity or because of geographical concentration or economic factors. And critical raw materials can include things like cobalt and lithium used in batteries. They can include rare earth elements, things like neodymium used in the magnets, right, in wind turbines, and silver used in solar panels. And these things have quite significant impacts themselves when they're being produced. Countries are starting to take a more strategic approach to securing access. I mean, some countries have been doing this for a long time. China, for decades, has been very strategic about securing access. And so it actually controls quite a disproportionate share in some cases of some critical raw materials. The EU has recently introduced a new strategy on critical raw materials, and in the net zero strategy just published a couple of weeks ago, the UK government also committed to producing a new critical minerals strategy next year. So it's getting more attention, but because of the impacts involved in accessing these resources, it's important not just to secure access to them, but how you go about securing access is going to be so important. And just to give a bit of scary data, the World Bank has estimated that by 2050, production of critical raw materials might need to increase by as much as 500%, which suggests that there could be quite significant supply risks. Here in the UK, research which we're going to be producing, we're going to be publishing recently, we'll be publishing shortly with Green Alliance, shows that the UK is on track, according to its current net zero transition plans, to use far more than its fair share of total global reserves of some of these critical raw materials, well before we even get to net zero in 2050 or 2045 here in Scotland, hopefully. So the rapid increases in demand for these materials, and also the fact that some countries are on track to use more than their share, suggests that the pathways that we choose for how to secure access to critical raw materials is going to be really important, both in ensuring that we don't face unnecessary risks as we go about our net zero transition, but also making sure that the impacts on other countries of the pathway we choose is fair. We need to think about sort of wider systemic impacts. So basically, to sum up before we start the discussion, we don't want our own transition to net zero to drive more and more polluting, extractive, carbon-intensive activities elsewhere in the world. But we also don't want to have to slow down our net zero transition. It's important that we can keep up that pace. So the question I'm going to be putting to the panellists today is, what are the alternatives to just more and more mining and extraction to secure access to the critical raw materials that we need for this net zero transition? Before I move into people answering that question, I'll do some brief introductions. Our first speaker, Professor John Barrett, unfortunately can't be here because he tested positive yesterday for COVID-19, sadly, which is apparently the second time he's had COVID, so poor John. But John is an expert on energy and climate policy at Leeds University's Sustainable Research Institute, and he's also a co-director at the Centre for Research in Energy Demand Solutions, CREDS. John's been working in climate, energy and resources policy for over 20 years and has really had a big impact on policy, I say both at UK and devolved level. He produces some really critical data sets, for example, for tracking our resources-based emissions, so the consumption-based emissions data set is produced by his team. He's also been a lead author for Working Group 3 of the International Panel on Climate Change, so yeah, it really has a lot of impact from the research he does, and we're sadly he can't join us, but very happy that we'll be able to share a video with his contribution after this. Stuart Hayward-Hyam doesn't need very much introduction, I think, in these circles, but he's Technical Development Director at Suez UK. With over 30 years of experience in the industry, he's bringing an awful lot of experience and expertise to this conversation on how to use waste as a valuable resource, how to reduce waste as well. And Stuart's also a member of Green Alliance's Circular Economy Task Force, where we produce evidence to try and improve resources policy making. So thanks very much for joining us, Stuart. Lorna Bennett joins us from the Offshore Renewable Energy Catapult, where she's a project engineer. And Lorna works with SMEs and academia and other organisations to try and overcome some of the big technological challenges facing the offshore power sectors. And Lorna's currently involved in work developing a circular economy in the wind sector. So really happy to have that engineering perspective on the panel today. Dr. Jack Barry is a research fellow at Chatham House and looks at the intersections between the circular economy and global trade, geopolitics, finance and sustainability. And Jack has a PhD in circular economy innovation policy and was also formerly at Zero Waste Scotland along with myself. So Jack's going to be bringing a sort of international dimension to this conversation. Really happy to have you here as well, Jack. Come all the way from Edinburgh to join us. Right, so yesterday I put my initial question to John Barrett, and we're now going to play a video which is his chance to contribute to the conversation remotely.
The net zero transition is obviously going to require considerably more resources to help us decarbonise our electricity sector, but also the expansion of that sector, along with others, to in essence provide what we need to achieve that transition. However, there are alternatives to us pursuing a path which requires more and more resources, and that is to consider the amount of energy demand that we are consuming and we're using in our everyday lives. And the recent report by the Centre for Research into Energy Demand Solutions, which I led, tries to evaluate how much we can reduce our energy demand in the UK. And what we found was that from 2020 levels, we could halve our energy demand by 2050, but while still maintaining a high quality of life for all the citizens in the UK. And the advantage of this approach is that we simply don't need an electricity system of the same size, and therefore all the critical metals and other resources that need to go into the transformation of the electricity system are nowhere near the scale. We showed that we could reduce investment in electricity by 40% and still meet our net zero targets. And so therefore there is an alternative pathway, one which in essence considers the best way to deliver a reduction in energy demand. And that really requires government to actively pursue that policy. And then one of the co-benefits really is to reduce the amount of resources that we need.
Okay, thanks. And how seriously do you think demand reduction is taken at the moment in current government policies?
We think that demand reduction is not taken as seriously as it could be. And this is partly reflected in the government's net zero plan, where it almost portrays the idea that our demand is fixed and all we need to do is try and provide the most decarbonised way to meet that demand. But demand can change, it's malleable, it changes over time based on attitudes, behaviours, the structure of our economy, the way that we want to move, the food that we want to eat. So therefore, for us to assume that it's fixed really just does not represent what's happened in the past either. And it also means that we, in essence, start on a high-risk path to achieving our net zero goals. If we're not going to touch and try and affect demand, what we're arguing is that we must do all of that through decarbonisation or unproven engineered carbon dioxide removal technologies. They are very resource-intensive options. And also, as I said, some of them are unproven. So in reality, we're making a rod for our own back by fixing and building in higher levels of demand, which then need more resources to meet that demand. They made it very clear that we don't want to be, the government doesn't want to be considering issues such as reducing meat consumption, aviation, that we should all be allowed to drive as far as we like, as long as we like. And in reality, all these elements don't always add to our quality of life either. And they also affect our local environments. So if we think about energy demand reduction, we're also thinking about communities that are safer, healthier and more active. And so in reality, we're ignoring those co-benefits by not, in essence, taking, I suppose, energy demand seriously.
Okay, so a kind of business as usual approach where we're really focusing on switching to new technologies rather than changing the way we do business and live our lives. That leads to higher risks in terms of resource consumption and resource security.
Yes, it does. So we will be considerably more reliant on imports of key resources. We already have over 300 million tonnes of carbon embedded in our imports that we consume in the UK. Our imports are pretty much now half of our consumption-based emissions. And this is likely to be considerably more in the future as we decarbonise at a faster rate than the global average. So in that respect, it maintains a strong reliance on imports, which also leave us vulnerable to price changes. And if demand is going to increase for those specific materials as other countries commit to decarbonising in COP, then we in essence could face higher prices in a more costly transition. So we can't just ignore our levels of demand. And as I said, what we've tried to demonstrate is that we can reduce energy demand while maintaining or even enhancing our quality of life. And so therefore it's a mixed opportunity, but it does mean a government that's willing to, in essence, have a proper conversation with people about how we might need to live differently and put the infrastructure in place to allow people to live a lifestyle which has a lower impact. And it really comes down to whether the government feels it can go there or not. Otherwise, it's really making this a very expensive and difficult transition.
Interesting. And are there particular sectors that you'd pick out as areas that we should focus on for demand reduction?
So we identified in our report that we could achieve at least a 50% reduction in almost every single sector, with the exception of industry, which would be about a 26 to 30% reduction. Transport emissions, or energy demand, I should say, can come down by nearly 70%, based on both the shift to electric vehicles, but also the reduced distance travelled. In our scenario, we don't reduce the number of trips, but we reduce the length of those trips and how we might go about taking them. using shared forms of public transport or active forms of mobility, cycling and walking and so on. But in every other sector, it's there as well. And we can enhance both the technologies such as heat pumps to help reduce energy demand, but we can also then think about how we're using energy and heat in our homes. And extending it beyond the technology perspective to how we live our lives is what gives us the larger scale of reduction. Industry doesn't go down quite so far, because we will need industry to help produce some of the materials that we will need. But we still get about a 26 to 30% reduction there as well. So it's a whole economy approach that's needed with sort of varying levels of I suppose, infrastructure, social change, behaviour change, and technologies, depending on the sector that you're looking at.
Okay. Right, so if you're watching, John, then get well soon. Thanks very much for that. So Stuart, coming to you next. So John's talked about the potential to reduce demand through reducing energy demand and other forms of demand, but to reduce our reliance on raw materials being imported from elsewhere, surely circular economy measures are going to have to be a big part of that, to capturing, recovering and reprocessing materials within the economy. Could you perhaps talk a bit about the potential for that at the moment?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of stock in circulation. We don't know how much. We don't know how much is legacy. Just go in your own house and check how many phones, old computers, TVs and other things are dotted around. The problem with legacy is you need artisans to understand what's there. The number of PP3 batteries we get that weren't manufactured 30 years ago, that were in granny's shed or granddad's loft, which you need specialists to understand, and the specialist process, and that costs. So you've got the process. I think we as a sector are good at moving tonnes. We're just starting to move to kilograms, which is an interesting move for our sector as we start to value things in kilograms. But when you're looking here, you're talking about grams and tens of grams, and you're looking for key components in materials, and that requires a very different approach, because you've got to try and protect them on the way back. You've got to understand how to bring them back. You've got to understand how to separate them, how they were constructed, how they got a nickel cadmium battery, how they got a lithium ion battery, because you have to treat them differently, you have to store them differently. So there's a lot of that, and I think there's a lot of work we should be doing with producers to give us an easier way to recognise them with like a barcode on the back or some other methodology, a little like we're doing with digital marking on single-use packaging, for instance. So you can say it's food contact, non-food contact. You want something on the back, you can quickly read it and go, okay, this is a nickel cadmium, it was made of this, it's got these key components in it, and therefore it goes left, right, in the middle. Because at the moment we've got so many different materials come back. You see some of the results that are coming from Take Back in terms of just the volume that are stored in people's houses. Tens of kilos are coming back while they do the clear outs. And it's all old stuff, never mind the current stuff. And then you've got the churn in the current stuff. How does it go? What's your family cascade? You know, my phone becomes my son's cascade in that process. He sells it on into the second-hand market, and you've got all those cascades of materials that are staying in there. You've then got I call the vertical integration. So you've got Apple coming in and going, actually, I want my phones back. And I've designed my own recovery system for those. So then Apple phones go one way and Android phones go another way. So it's a very complicated system. The first part is to get them back. Can we repair them, reuse them? A lot of critical, items with critical materials in them, TVs and things like that, get broken in the bring transport back. If you treat them like tons or kilos, they get broken before they're back, and therefore you've already degraded them. So getting them back in a way that we can repair them, refurbish them, and whatever it is, and that keep them in the circulation, that reduces demand in the first place. Second part then is, if we can't do that, can we cannibalise them for spare parts? We do it for lots of other items. If you go to one of our EU subs, you see them going, okay, I can't repair the bike, but I can take the brakes off it, I can take the wheels off it, I can take this, that and the other off it. And then when something else comes in, oh, that matches that. So there's a whole pile of kind of components that should become off that could be reused in repairing other items when it's one part that's gone wrong. And then you've got, and what have I now left with, and how do I get those key components back and back into a system that does deal in grams or micrograms of material in a sector and a population that's used to kilograms and tons. And that's probably been our biggest challenge, is how do you harvest the material back from consumers, from employees, from businesses in a way that keeps them workable for as long as possible, and then segment them. So we've got a massive challenge in this legacy of stuff that's currently in flow. We don't really know how much is there. The number of Blackberries and old Nokias and stuff that'll be knocking around somewhere. We need to make that design change at the front end so that we can see how they were made before we start going down the next generation of devices and key components in them. So we can go, okay, I know that serial number, it's from that series, they made it this way, this is how you deconstruct it and send it that way. If we can get rid of some of the harmful and hazardous gases in some of them, the mercuries and other bits and bobs, that makes decommissioning far less costly, because you can break them and take them apart in a normal atmosphere, where some have to be broken in the sealed atmosphere, so you can get rid of the harmful gases before you get rid of them. So there's a whole pile of design stuff for the future. And I think as we expand our use, then that's good. And I think there's a lot of focus, if I just take batteries, on cars and the end-of-life vehicle directive that should manage those. But you just look at the plethora of large lithium batteries that now go in bikes, scooters, and other devices, which have a lot of power and a lot of materials in them that you want back, but they're not. There's no organisation to get them back. There's no structure. They don't come back in the same organised. If your Tesla breaks down and you want the batteries back, it's going to go through a fairly organised system. The rest of it is a bit like the Wild West at the moment, and organising that so that we can bring them back. We don't want them in the rest of the system because we have enough fires now in the system with small batteries, small lithium-ion batteries. When you've got a bike battery in there, if that's been taken out by the user and put in their bin, there's a lot of energy stored in that. And not only do we lose the battery and the key components, we lose half the truck or the facility that goes with it, none of which is acceptable to us. So there's a lot of system change to happen as well. So a huge amount to work. My first request was, can we just label them in some way that we can actually identify what they and how they were constructed, and not necessarily this is X grams of gold and silver, etc., but more we can identify them back to a production schedule that says if you place anything on market, you can trace it back to a production schedule that says, oh, now I recognise it. That doesn't require an expert. That's just a bit of data matching. And then you can put it into a batch, and then if you batch process, Henry Ford learnt many years ago that doing things consistently and regularly is the cheapest way of doing it. If I'm going, this is that, right, that goes that way, right, what's this, right, take it apart, have a look at it, that's a lot of cost in that. And there isn't the money in the grams of material yet to pay for that, and we just induce lots of inefficiency. So lots of change, huge potential, loads of stuff that we've already got. Been trying to work back, and I haven't managed to do it yet, to work out what the intrinsic store is of materials that we have at home. That's because we don't have really good data. But if you take the tech back and say it's 20 kilos a household and then trace that back, that's a lot of households yet to release stuff before we get to steady state at some point.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I remember seeing an article a little while ago about the number of devices people have on average stuck in a drawer at home, and it's quite scarily high, but we can probably all relate to that.
And there's a lot of perception, there's a lot of fear around data. So you've got to get over that, and to suppose if you give your material back, it will be cleaned before it goes into the system, because people will hold on to it because I'm slightly worried about, did I clean my phone, or that laptop's so that I don't know how to get into it now, but there might be something on it. So it's that process of confidence to release it back into the system.
Yeah. I think the point about improving the labelling, that is on the agenda at the moment, isn't it, in government? But not much seems to be happening on the National Materials Data Hub idea, which might be able to overcome some of the data barriers.
Yeah, we were kind of disappointed that there wasn't anything in the budget to support that. And I think that it's super important that we trace that. If you look at some of the other countries, they've actually got effectively a calculation. You can just tap in and go, how much lithium have we got in transit in the country at the moment, and it will give you an idea of what the figure is. And that allows you to hold a balance of product that's in transit in the system. And then you just need to understand when it's likely to appear at the other end to recover it. And then you can start planning resources against it. Facilities, deconstruction facilities, all of those different things. So yeah, there's a lot of work to do around just stocking it. We don't even know how much is placed on the market. There's so much transit movement across borders and things. it's a no stock, and I think that the government's missing a trick if it doesn't get on with the materials data hub, because the sooner we start, the sooner we have good data, the sooner we have good data, the sooner we start planning better.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. I'll move on to you now, Lorna. So if we zoom in a little bit to the offshore wind sector that you work in, what's going on from the engineering perspective? How are engineers trying to overcome the challenge of resource security for these materials, whether it's through circular economy measures or demand reduction or other measures that we've not discussed yet at all?
Yeah, exactly. Oh, hear myself. Wasn't expecting that, sorry. Apart from being guilted into feeling the need to go home and clear out my drawers and cupboards now. Yeah, there's so many things happening. For anyone that's not familiar with the Catapults network, we are the leading centre for innovation in offshore renewables in the UK, and it's my job to basically work with everyone and anyone, as Susan said at the start, who's interested in improving the offshore renewable industry. And over the last year, it's been my job to lead the delivery of all of our projects looking at energy transition and circular economy. So we have a couple of programmes running, one the circular economy for the wind sector, which Susan's already mentioned. We have a project running through that programme with Zero Waste Scotland, looking at that kind of materials mapping. So specifically, as part of the circular economy for the wind sector, we're trying to build that materials database of what we think is currently installed in the wind industry, and estimate when those will come to the end of their lives and what materials will be available for reuse and how we could reuse them within the wind industry, or what other sectors we could partner with in terms of making sure those materials stay in the UK, stay in circulation, retain value, and remove the need for that constant mining of new virgin materials or importing them. We also have the Energy Transition Alliance in partnership with the Net Zero Technology Centre, looking at how we can work together with traditional hard-to-abate sectors like the oil and gas industry to pull the decades of knowledge they have of operating offshore and remanufacturing, reusing materials and things, and where there's crossovers of knowledge. But kind of looking at the existing stock that we have as a massive issue we're looking at in terms of sustainable decommissioning, that circular economy question. But there's a lot of projects looking at what we do with the kind of up and coming. So I'm not sure how familiar everyone is with the plans for the offshore wind sector, but we currently have about 11 gigawatts of offshore wind installed in the UK. Now the current aim is that will be 40 gigawatts by 2030 and at least 75 gigawatts by 2050 to meet our net zero targets. So we're looking at 7 to 8 times that growth that we've had in the last 20, 30 years over the next 20, 30 years. And that's going to require tons of materials, and where we're going to get those resources from, and how we can obviously meet those demands without outstripping other countries and taking more than our share. You've obviously got the global financial inequalities, and we don't want to exacerbate any of those environmental inequalities as well. So we've got companies we're working with like Renewable Parts. Their entire business model is built around refurbishing and restoring components so that they can be reused, their life's extended for another full life cycle or more. So many different companies. I'm trying to think of ones we can talk about openly. Another one we've been working with my colleagues down at our test facilities in Blyth, Northumberland, Greenspur. They've been designing a new direct drive generator for the next generation of offshore wind turbines that will use ferrite magnets instead of neodymiums, because, as you say, we've got that kind of political, financial complications with getting those masses of resources, and then again loads of companies looking at how we can extract and retain those materials and reuse them again. But I guess the first question I kind of skipped to the end at the start there, sorry, is there's a lot of focus at the moment on life extension, so that obviously that won't remove the challenges of where we get resources from and what we do with them at the end of their life, but it kind of shifts everything and retains value and brings in energy. before we need to use more energy to start breaking things down and trying to work out where to reuse them.
So does that involve more repairing and refurbishment of existing infrastructure then?
Yes, so exactly. So things like what renewable parts are already doing, where if a gearbox breaks, for example, they can repair or replace the broken component within the system, and the whole system's reused rather than just throwing the whole system away and getting a replacement one. Or in the worst case scenario, the whole turbine's condemned because this key component's gone, and maybe it's out of manufacture. The original manufacturers have stopped producing them, so they can't get a replacement part, so they'll just basically the turbine ends up going in the bin. That's an extreme case. There's other cases where if a site is out of lease, its planning consent has maybe expired, they've not been given permission for a life extension, they've maybe got to decommission a wind farm, or it's not considered financially viable to continue operating that wind farm. There's instances where turbines have been removed and then sold to the second-hand market, whether it's in Eastern Europe or Africa or India, and the whole turbine is then transported for reuse in a second lifetime somewhere else entirely. So it's good that that's staying, it's retaining its value, it's retaining its purpose, but it's then obviously leaving our economy, and we can't reuse those materials to further develop our own offshore wind ambitions. But so again, that kind of looking at that aspect, we've been having these discussions about how do we ensure that cycle continues. How can we continue to maintain turbines later in life? And there's been a lot of discussions around designing for remanufacture or repair, and in some cases even upgrade. So can you design a system to be more modular so that parts of it can be replaced or upgraded more easily, so that there's less wastage overall.
And what stage of maturity would you say we're at in that kind of discussion at the moment? Is it largely theoretical, are there pilots underway, or people actually rolling out the sort of modular infrastructure?
I think it's a bit of everything. So as I say, we're having a lot of discussions. Obviously a large part of our kind of network is those SMEs, those innovative technology developers, but we are starting to have those discussions with the OEMs, the equipment manufacturers. We have a lot of discussions around circular economy with the operators, who are very keen to do as much as they can to reduce the waste of their property at the end of its life, or how can they continue to operate it and maintain it. So a big topic at the moment, less on the critical rare materials question, but the wind industry sees the composite materials used in the wind turbine blades, and some of the outside structures, as a massive black mark on the green credentials, because composite materials, a lot of plastic, a lot of fibres that are difficult to recycle, difficult to reuse. So there's a lot of focus on how do we improve the environmental and sustainability aspects of those materials. I guess not necessarily the critical level of materials, but actually as the turbines get bigger, the blades get longer to stop them getting heavier, to retain the strength they need to spin at 200 meters per second up in the sky. They're using a lot more carbon fibre. The production of carbon fibre uses a lot of energy, a lot of water, a lot of resources, and it's a lot easier or the desire to recycle that is higher because it has a higher value. And one company we're speaking to, Gen 2 Carbon, their business model is built around recycling carbon fibres, and they're seeing slightly scary projections for the growth and the requirement for carbon fibre globally over the next few years, because just about every sector they're working in is looking to expand at an alarming rate.
Yeah, well, that's interesting. That brings us to one of the points about critical materials, is that the definition of critical materials can change very much over time, can't
Exactly.
as different materials become in demand. Jack, should we turn to you? So, we've talked about different pathways. There's energy demand, circularity, bit of diversification of which materials we use. So all those different pathways have different implications for the countries where we often source critical raw materials from. So from the perspective of a country, perhaps a lower income country that might be experiencing some negative impacts from mining, but it might also be quite dependent on the revenue from the mining sector as well. What are the implications of these different pathways?
It's fairly major implications. It's quite a big question, really, to cover. But I think there's, you kind of break it down into two. There's what's going to happen to our demand, and how's that going to impact these countries, and then what are we going to do about it? And the two of you have covered that quite well. I'll pick up on that in the end. But I think it's important to put into proportion, you mentioned 500% increase in demand. Well, latest IEA report, International Energy Agency report, is now ramped it up to 600% by 2040 if we're to meet our the Sustainable Development Scenario. So slightly more ambitious than the net zero target. But that's just an average. If we start looking at specific critical raw materials like lithium, that's going to go up 4,000%. Cobalt and nickel will go up between 2,000 and 2,500 times by 2040. So it's really a staggering rate of growth in these critical raw materials, and they're predominantly mined in lower income, middle income countries. And these countries, they have the ecosystems, critical ecosystems that regulate the global climate, as well as very high biodiversity indexes. So you've got a real tension there. And, you'll be familiar with the environmental impacts of mining. You've obviously got kind of open strip mining, where you tear away the earth and then you core out the ore. And that obviously creates habitat destruction and air pollution and water pollution. But you've also got tailings ponds, which come out the back of it, and that's when you mine out your materials, your ores, and to get your critical raw materials, particularly rare earth metals, they're really low density in these mined materials. So you have to do a whole load of processing with some pretty toxic materials, and that turns into like a toxic sludge, which is then pumped into these tailing ponds. And the tailing ponds can be, the longest one in the world is 18 kilometers long. So, and you're talking about hundreds of thousands of gallons of this toxic sludge being pumped into these tailings ponds. And these can also contain radioactive materials, so thorium. And if that gets into the watercourse and you ingest thorium, you get pancreatic cancers, you get all sorts of health issues. And there's been numerous cases where these tailings ponds have failed, flooding entire valleys and communities that are downstream, and it's very, very difficult to clean up. So you've got your kind of traditional strip mining, right? But you've also got these kind of new approaches to mining to get these critical materials. Lithium has been mentioned quite a lot. We need it for our EVs, we need it for pretty much any sort of battery storage. And lithium's comes from a few spots in the world. Chile's one of the epicenters, and it's either mined from rock or it's mined from the salt pans. And when you mine it from the salt pans, you have to draw a whole load of fresh water out of the aquifer, and then pump it down to produce a brine, and then you get your lithium out of that. But to refine your lithium, you have to kind of do quite a lot of toxic work, and then you pump that brine back into not into the aquifer, but down into a holding point. And just to, I guess, put that into context, this is a very back of the envelope calculation on the spot, but it uses about 2.5 million litres of water to produce a ton of lithium, and that's probably about 3/4 of this room amount of water to produce a ton of lithium. And so in Chile, in the salt pans, it's used in about 60% of the region's water at current production levels. And obviously, if lithium is going to go up to 4,000% in demand, you can see some fairly major environmental problems there. So there's a whole range of environmental issues, but there's also social issues, and that kind of comes in two categories. Mining's very labour intensive, so you've obviously got some challenges around labour conditions. So cobalt, which is predominantly mined in the Congo, you commonly see artisanal mining, hand-dug mines, very often by children, with no protective equipment. And if these mines collapse, while the children are stuck in the mines. But it's not only the labour issues, you've also got environmental campaigners. There's 52 of the 220 people that were environmental campaigners that died last year, that were killed, were protesting over mining. So it's the biggest category risk, and over 167 human rights violations recorded last year. And what's more critical is that a third of those are linked to European mining companies. So yeah, the issue lies at home as well as abroad. And then you've obviously got environmental, and you touched on, it provides taxes to local, very much needed taxes in a lot of ways. But there's also the question of whether those taxes duly reflect the environmental and social impacts that are created in the local environment, and also whether it's fairly calculated based on the extraction of wealth out of the country. So there's environmental, economic and social challenges. And so the question is, what do we do about this? All right, we need to get to net zero. So we clearly need to ramp up our demand for these critical materials. But what do we do? How do we square this circle? And I guess there's two things we need to do, as far as I'm concerned. One is to absolutely reduce our consumption as much as possible. And the second is to ensure a just transition for the countries that we are importing these critical materials from. So in terms of how to reduce our consumption, circular economy, I mean, you've both covered that really well, and John picked it up as well. Absolutely critical, particularly delivering efficiency gains. And you know, your examples of repair, remanufacture, wind turbines, and all the different renewable technologies, absolutely critical. But on top of that, when we look at the scale of the demand, you know, 4,000%, efficiency gain is not going to get us there. So we need to start looking beyond efficiency to think about material sufficiency. And that's consuming the right level of resources for optimum health and well-being. So that's not over-consuming, where it's conspicuous consumption leading to environmental destruction, but not under-consuming, which leads to poverty. It's finding that middle ground. And sufficiency, it takes a bit of a mindset shift, because it's thinking about how we can really absolutely reduce our consumption. And that's looking beyond like repairing and remanufacturing to redesigning our cities to be 20 minutes to walk anywhere, right? So you don't even need a car, or you can car share, which reduces demand by times 10. Or think of all, you know, what COVID's done. It's hollowed out our cities. Office blocks are empty, and yet we're still building out on the suburbs, sprawling even further. So it's thinking about how we can use our building stock much more effectively, retrofitting buildings to be multi-use, can be used by different people at different times, and therefore reducing the building size, meters squared per person in the country. If you do that, you significantly reduce demand for materials and all the energy that's associated with that. So that's the kind of how do we deal with our demand. But we've also got to think, if we start circulating materials in Scotland, if we start recycling our wind turbines, for example, well, that's going to reduce our trade with these countries which are dependent on the export of virgin materials for their economic base. So how do we deal with that? And that's a very contentious topic, but there are quite a lot of discussions now globally, like the GACERI, which is the Global Alliance on Circular Economy and Resource Efficiency. There's a platform for accelerating the circular economy. There's the African Circular Economy Alliance. So there's all these now kind of global coalitions thinking about how we could ensure a just transition for everyone. So as we become more circular and reduce trade with low-income and middle-income countries, how can we work with them to ensure that the mining we do is sustainable and fair and legitimate, but also gives due rights to communities and indigenous communities to reject any mining site, which currently doesn't happen. And then we also it's equivalent to the 100 billion climate fund, but for materials, to help particularly low-income countries develop their own circularity and therefore economic resilience. So I think it's quite a big and expansive topic. It's quite complex, but I think we need to start thinking about that. And the interesting thing, in the week of COP, the Scottish Government announced, whether it's yesterday or a couple of days ago, that they've launched a damage and loss fund. So it's one of the first times a government has recognised that the actions that it's doing domestically is impacting other countries. And I think that's a really excellent thing that we need to do, but rather than £1 million fund, it needs to be 100 billion if we're actually going to do this properly. So, so yeah, I'll stop there.
Thanks. Yeah, it's interesting that at the same time as looking at our just transition domestically, we should be thinking about that just transition away from these sort of damaging industries further afield. If we maybe touch a bit on the topic of the options for diversifying the range of materials and technologies that we're looking at. I mean, Lorna, you mentioned this briefly, but I noticed that this week some world leaders, including the UK, US, EU, China and India, committed to better international coordination on developing the markets and standards for key green technologies. Now that makes a lot of sense from an economic point of view in terms of developing economies of scale, so to try and really drive growth in these technologies. But in terms of resource security, it sounds actually a bit scary that you might be further standardizing and all going for the same things at the same time. So what are the implications there? What's the trade-off there between wanting to diversify for resource security purposes, but also wanting economies of scale, wanting things to be viable? Who would like to come in on that?
Well, I can start and then pass on. There's an interesting thing going on with batteries actually around the world, talking about how we need to kind of be harmonizing. Well, what we're seeing is actually America is now really ramping up domestic mining of lithium to secure their supply, mostly for Tesla. And the UK is also now looking at launching its first kind of lithium mine as well. But India, who's got a ton of bauxite, they've got really big bauxite reserves, are now pushing a lot around a kind of aluminium-based battery, and because they've got the supply for it. And then China's actually now looking at sodium-based because they've got a huge reserve of sodium. So different countries, based on the critical materials they've got, will push for the technologies to sync with that. And what we maybe risk seeing at a global level is 100 different technological solutions. And therefore that gets really difficult when you want to start trading in secondary goods, secondary technologies. You have to ship them all to one place to get the critical mass to make the economics work to repair or remanufacture them, and then reprocess them back into new products. But if you've got 100 different dominant batteries, and it's what Stuart was saying, when you have a waste stream coming in that's so complex and confusing, then you've got a real problem. So there's a risk that that's happening in the geopolitics, because you can secure supply for your own thing, your own technology. That's the way it's going. Yeah.
Interesting. Anyone else want to add anything?
Yeah, so I think for me, and just taking that varied different approaches, the first part of regularising is standards. So we have a standard for a sodium battery, we have a standard for an aluminium battery, a lithium battery, and it's internationally accepted, and we know what's in the product. That's a really good start for the system. We can't manage innovation because it's by its very nature disruptive, but you can start to just measure the impact and where it's going, and then you can organise the supply chains behind that, be them international or domestic, depending on where they're going. But if we randomise it, which is what I think where we're going at the moment, there won't be any common standards. There'll be different standards in different places, and then you've got a whole pile of pain trying to separate them out and understand what they are and what to do with them. And that tends to, if I was to lead you down the route of, especially if it's manual, low-wage economies, so you then ship some material off to low-wage because that's the only way you can afford to dismantle them, because you can't systemize it, because you haven't done the work in the first place. And I think it is, it rests with our advanced economy countries to actually set those standards out, because at that point then we can systemize it. If we can systemize it, we can do robots and we can do lots of other things, which means we're not reliant on low-wage economies to support the dismantling, because they have to be manually done. And so I think standards key to roll out, and I don't think that's unachievable given the world commitment in COP to working together to solve problems.
So back to understanding what's in products and having that clearly labelled being important.
Yeah, I think it's a challenge we're already struggling with in terms of, standards on everything. Food, there's things that we can buy in the UK that you can't buy in the US, and vice versa. Everything's, labelled, marked, standard, permitted, health and safety safe. You've got CE marks in Europe. We do that with most, if not all, products already. I think the diversification of materials and minerals in particular is important. As you say, if just about every sector is looking to expand at the moment, everybody's clamouring for more resources. Every country is desperate for more resources to meet these demands. So if everyone's focusing on the same thing, then it's going to run out faster. Whereas every country, if they focus on what they have, then it makes sense. And as you said at the start, talking about the land needs for various, food, crops, agriculture, bio diesels and things that are now, you've got sugar being grown, so the cane can be used and recycled for various renewable fuels and things like that. So, there's huge demands on everything we're doing, and the more we can do to diversify and find alternatives, so we're putting less strain in one area, it spreads the load a little bit, and it spreads the focus. I think is an important thing we need to consider as well, because if everything's standardised and everyone needs, thousands of hectares of ground to grow biofuels, but then what happens to your food resource? What happens to your animals, your livestock, your everything else? And as you see, mining as well, the amount of land that takes up, and the deforestation that we're currently seeing and hearing protests about in the Amazon to meet those demands, and we're trying to plant more trees to replace those, and everything's fighting for the same resources. So the more we can kind of spread that load, but keep the health and safety and the standards up, I think that's quite an important thing to be considering.
And that sort of brings me on quite nicely to the next thing I was going to ask. So, if you look at current policy documents, whether in the UK or elsewhere, or analysis by the International Energy Agency recently as well, there does seem to be still a focus on diversifying mining, diversifying production, rather than sort of circular economy and demand reduction aspects. There's been talk about expanding mining here in the UK as well, but of course if you look at what we're also trying to do on things like biodiversity, restoring nature, and competing land demands, do you think that's realistic? No one here is sort of a geologist or in the mining sector, but do you have views on whether that's a realistic option, doing more mining here in the UK, whether there might be some positives to that as well as negatives?
I think it comes back to what John was saying at the start. We need to, seriously think about what our actual needs are and stop just trying to increase the demand because we can. I think if we start with the circular economy, what do we already have? When will it become available for a second life? What can we reuse that for? Because at the moment, there's a lot of things that we could reuse that are going into landfill. And in some countries, because of the politics, because of the trade and financial situation, they're starting to mine their old landfills for the resources they've already thrown away because they know how valuable that is. So if we can actually make better use of the resources we have, as you say, stop looking at things as waste and look at them as resources that can be reused, then we significantly reduce the need for mining, and this question may hopefully become a bit moot.
Yeah.
It comes back to the comment you made about the resource hub. If we know what we've got, and we know what we need, we can start working on the gap, be it a positive or negative gap, and we can start to plan. And this whole process is around planning. What do we need? When do we need it? What materials do we need? Where we can get them from? How much have we got in stock, in transit, in our own geological mining systems? And then you start to understand what you need to do, and then you can start having dialogues with other countries if you need to negotiate with them for resources, because they're more and that whole value chain starts to work. I think at the moment my feeling is we're clamouring for the outcome without truly understanding the pain of getting there and the impact on the value chains of supplying the materials for the outcome, because it's politically very good for us to be going for a net zero target without really having to look at the consumption that goes with it, and making some of those really hard personal decisions around how many phones do I need, how many TVs do I need, and those sort of processes. Do I need 2 cars because I've got 2 cars now? I'm actually going to get away with 1 car with a change of public transport, therefore I can halve my consumption need. And the plans are very much, well, there's X number of cars on the system at the moment, we'll just replace them with others, and you go, oh, no, that's not really going to be supportable. I don't think the resources, I think your report will show exactly what that's going to do to UK demand, and we've got to be fair on an international basis, and if we're not fair, then we'll create tensions, and those tensions will ultimately hurt us in some way or the other.
Yeah, I mean, you and I both have teenagers that were well prepared with arguments when they ask for another car. Yes, Jack?
Yeah, because you mentioned the outcomes are kind of, try bounding towards the outcomes, but I don't think we've spent enough time really thinking about what the outcome is. And net zero is scary to me because you mentioned consumption emissions. Net zero just measures our territorial emissions we produce within the country. And that's only half of our carbon footprint. So even if we meet net zero and all the material impacts of that, we've only addressed half of our actual total carbon emissions. And I think a lot of the public don't recognise that. And what is net zero? What is it? What kind of society does that produce? Bigger questions around what's the point of the economy? Is it to deliver growth in GDP, or is it to deliver well-being? And I think it's those type of questions we need to be having now, because that should dictate our trajectory towards net zero. But what John said is those conversations haven't been had, and so we've set a trajectory to net zero which is based on the status quo. How do we just replace our current demand for energy with renewable energy? And that does not solve the problem. And even if we meet 100% renewable energy, well, we're still going to keep consuming resources. We're still going to be consuming Earth's resources. So it's actually maybe even going to accelerate it, because it'll make energy cheaper. So we're not solving the systemic problem. And one more point to pick up on that actually is critical raw materials like rare earths. They're actually a tiny volume of the global trade in commodity and virgin materials. And so we can be circular in that, but that's not going to solve the greater problem. Steel, cement, aluminium, all these massive material commodities that we really need to be tackling if we want to have a big impact. And so it's that wider picture, not just net zero technologies, but the whole economy we need to be thinking about.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, a fair amount of concrete and steel in a wind turbine, right?
I think just to pick the one up, I think we can't get building demolition right. We kind of demolish it looking for the resources as, we've got X number of tons of steel. Well, what we should be doing is we've got X number of I-beams, which are perfectly fit for purpose if we dismantle them properly, that we can just reuse and not have to remelt them and reform them. So we can't get simple deconstruction of a building right. We've not even allowed the basis for understanding how we're going to do grams, not kilograms and tons. And if we get that right, then we can translate it down and go, actually, well, what's in the phone that we want, or what's in the device, or what's in the wind turbine? And then you start to approach it in a very different way. And then you go back to the designers, and we're doing some work around blade decommissioning and processes of how do you try and get the materials back. And you start doing the raw science early enough that when certainly when the land turbines start coming off and the sea turbine, you've actually got your infrastructure ready for when it's there, rather than going, I've now got a stockpile, what do I do with it in that process? And it's that, I think once you start to make a plan, And it feels to me a little bit like at the moment, because there's such a rush for net zero, that we're not spending the first 5%, which any project manager will know is the most important 5% of anything, going, and what do we want to do, and how we want to do it, and what do we need? And then once we've got that, then we can start off ourselves, and actually we'll accelerate quicker that way than we will do at the moment, which is just a rush to, I don't know, politically achieve a target, which isn't really a target, because it's only a domestic target, and it isn't really dealing with a kind of a one world living basis, it's just dealing with one part of one world living. We've stopped warming the planet, great, but we've then absolutely ravaged it for the resources that stop the want.
Yeah. So it's sort of a bit of less haste, more speed.
I don't know how you can go down a route of planning without understanding what do we need, and really challenging yourself. You know, how many cars do we need? I mean, electric cars, we're going to go electric car, but how many do we actually need, and is there a better way of doing it?
Right, I want to allow some time for questions from the online and offline audience. So some questions have started to come through already, but please, if you're watching remotely, please do send through questions. And also, I think there'll be a mic going around the room for people who want to ask here. So I can, should we start with an in-person question? Right, here's the microphone around.
Shall I just shout? Thank you very much indeed. Sarah Mukherjee, Chief Executive of the Institute of Environmental Management and Assessment. If I could be really cheeky and do 3 very, very quick ones. First of all, barcodes. I'm sure we can start doing some work on that. You know, we have a circular economy, hundreds of circular economy fellows, and I'm sure that seems like a really easy win. The second one is, you know, my old nan used to darn my socks because wool was expensive. Surely there will be a certain amount of market movement which will make a lot of uneconomic activities in terms of this space economic in the near future, kind of discuss. And the third one, we've talked a lot about cities. I mean, it's worth remembering that actually the real pinch points are in small market towns, rural communities as well, where nothing is 20 minutes walk away from anything else. Thank you.
So I agree with you. Barcodes is an easy win if I do your 3. I think in terms of the true cost of materials, I think we've got a lot of work to go. I know Scotland's doing a lot of work on understanding natural capital biodiversity as well as carbon and pricing that into decisions. And we're not quite there yet, I think, in understanding. But if we can get there, we can actually price it correctly. And then we just need the economic system to support it. And then I've forgotten your third question.
It was about the rural communities and urban communities.
But that's about being fair, isn't it? It's about, if you talk to someone who lives in a city, you go, well, do you want a car? Well, not really, because I can get around without a car. In which case you make transport convenient, and therefore you don't need. And in areas where you're travelling in all weathers and it's waiting 3 hours for the bus that comes twice a day, most of us will go, well, I'm not going to do that. A number of people have moaned about waiting an hour to get into the COP26 conference. There's a limit of all patience. That we have to be sensitive to the different communities that need to change, and the answer will be different to someone in Glencoe as it will be to someone who's in Edinburgh.
Sorry, just to come in on your second point there about the materials side of things. I think you're right, and it is something that is starting to develop. As Stuart just mentioned there, the Scottish Government has plans to put in landfill bans on a lot of materials so that they can't just be dumped, because that's the cheap option. They've already started doing that in a lot of countries in Europe, for instance. So companies are having to find innovative ways to reuse or recycle materials because they can't just dump them in landfills. And another discussion we've been overhearing and speculating on is what government policy or regulation or incentive might come for the offshore wind industry, in terms of they've already introduced a kind of requirement into any planning applications that there needs to be a certain amount of UK content built into the offshore wind farms. It's supposed to be 60% of all cost for constructing an offshore wind farm will go to the UK economy. So there's been discussions around whether there should be a circular economy kind of caveat put into those as well, whether, say, 60% of materials going into construction should be recycled or coming into a second life, or whether 95% of it has to be recycled into a second life on decommissioning. So there's already some of these discussions starting to have, and Stuart already mentioned the kind of end of life directive for automotive sector. So it is creeping in, but it's just taking too long.
I might ask one of the questions from the online audience now, just sort of keep it fair. So someone's asked, John Arthur has asked, could we have a deposit return scheme for waste electronics and electrical equipment, so people don't just hang on to old phones?
I think the value, so if we're looking at a kind of a plastic bottle value and a deposit of 20p, there's a proportionality. It's like 100 times more expensive than the material value or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So with a £1,000 iPhone, what's the deposit on that to require you to bring it back? And actually, I think you see the innovative from Apple is exchange it, do it.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there's better ways than DRS for the higher value items, because I don't know what deposit you'd put on a £1,000 iPhone to encourage the person to bring it back into the system.
Yeah, it's a bit like a sort of closed loop Apple deposit returns.
I think
manufacturers
taking control, they're the ones that are designing it. If they're designing deconstruction as well, and they want their own their materials, and most people don't own their phones, they're on some sort of contract, in which case that's EPR in its truest sense, and doesn't need a deposit, because actually if you're being offered £400 exchange for your old phone, then the deposit's 400 quid, isn't it? Yeah. And it's that a process of managing the return in a way that keeps the phone whole as possible to people who can dismantle it because they know it's an iPhone 3S produced at this point from this materials and this factory.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, at the moment it's hard to sort of imagine what you do with things that aren't within a system like that. Your phones that are just sort of cheap ones people just get rid of. I mean, you can put them in the recycling, and EPR will help with that to some degree, and hopefully expand the facilities there.
But I think, and we've done some work on curbside WEEE, but we're not pricing the value in the WEEE into the EPR system for collection at the moment. We're just pricing it in as the cost of getting it back, not necessarily the cost of getting it back in the way that is most useful or truly influences the system and the behaviours in the system. And maybe that's something else we need to look at.
Yeah. Okay, go back to the audience. Ross, do you want to choose?
Hi, I'm Amy Haddon from Schneider Electric. Thank you so much. This is a wonderful topic, and it's been a great panel. I've been doing some collaboration with scientists at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, which is just down the street from me. And they're doing some work on these same topics. So my first question is whether there is collaboration across countries to try to solve some of these issues along the lines of standardization. And then my second question related is we work with a lot of organizations now that are sourcing renewable energy. And part of what's driving that, of course, is the declining cost. And one of the interesting questions that I have had is where the externalities of the costs of these materials impacts sit. And that if companies were actually have to pay for the externalities of the project that they're working on, that then potentially makes the cost of the technology unaffordable. So I'm interested to hear both about collaboration and then sort of the economics of the system that you've described.
Okay, thanks. Jack?
I can start. So in terms of collaboration, there's an ISO standard being developed right now, a global circular economy ISO standard. But yeah, the question is what are you making a standard? Is it the production process? Is it its lifetime durability, repairability, toxicity, which is what the EU's eco-design standards, which are being revised, are going to start looking at. They're going beyond energy efficiency to actual repairability, the material element of it. But there's also standards in trade. How do we trade these around the world? And there's no globally agreed definition of what an environmental good is, environmental technology is. And when we start looking downstream in the shipment of e-waste for example. It's the biggest growing volume of waste. And when you ship it from country A to country B, it has to go through customs and port authorities and use these kind of PIC numbers and SE codes. But the codes don't pick up whether these are total waste electronics that can't even be recycled, or whether they can be recycled, or they can actually be reused and put into a secondary market. There's no differentiation. They're all classed as waste, which is like a gross misuse of a really valuable secondary product, and that's all around the world. And these definitions in trade are missing, and that means that you can't have really proper global trade in high quality secondary goods and materials. So that's an area the WTO are aware of, and it's the structured discussions for the environmental aspects of trade are really focusing on how to get these standards in place so that we can trade secondary goods and materials around the world in a fair and safe way. That's on the horizon, but it's certainly not there, and that's holding up a lot of movement.
Okay, thanks.
I think there's just one thing for me. When we see collaboration across the value chain, it's generally because you've got a common goal. And I think if you all understand your common goal, you understand you have a common purpose, and therefore you can deliver on that. And I'd argue in this area, there isn't necessarily a common goal. I think there's lots of nationalistic goals. Until you get a common goal, you're not going to get the full collaboration across the system.
And the other part of the question was about where do the costs of the externalities sit, and how do we embed those in a way that doesn't stop these technologies being economically viable? Is that right? Any ideas? Has anyone solved that one?
We had a chat about that earlier on with regard to food and food waste. I think pricing externalities is really hard because it depends. It's a bit like a life cycle analysis. It depends on what boundary you draw, what the answer you get. And externalities are really hard to do, I think. But I do think there is room. My own view is there room for a rough and ready calculator. Don't want perfection. A rough it says, okay, if I take this amount of lithium, this amount of cobalt from these areas and do this with it, then this is roughly, and I don't need any more than roughly, and therefore your full cost needs to account for that. And it may not be perfect, but it starts to get down that route. And if you're not doing that, then you're not pricing the externalities. And if you don't understand, and I can't remember, I think Jenny mentioned that Ian might even know it, that the stat that was 1 kilo of food is 25,000 bottles. So have we ever said to people, well, actually you waste 1 kilo of food, 1 caddy is 25,000 bottles equivalent in carbon. And then you go, oh, that's very different. And what have we done with your phone? When you throw your phone, and if you say, okay, that's X number of people's livelihoods, or whatever's in that process, and you need to create a sense of worth. It's not a transaction that's easily done. Sense of worth will then drive people to think twice before they do stuff.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's take one more online question. So someone with the surname Ikeson says, maybe drastically slashing consumption is the only solution to our problem. Do the panel think people and government are going to get on board with that in time?
I'll get my horse out. Yeah, we've got to reduce our consumption by 2/3. There isn't an easy way of doing that. You know, I've been playing that with myself and going, if I was going to reduce my personal consumption by 2/3, what am I willing to give up? Or what challenges do I need to set to other people to say, and can I make it different? But I don't think there's any other route for us to not only share resources between the human species, but also stop stealing from the bees and protecting biodiversity by using more resources than we are personally allocated. And you know, I'm a great fan of personal carbon calculators. I think we should have it as a country. And therefore every purchase you do shows the carbon you purchased. And then you start to inform how people purchase and what they purchase and how much they waste. And without that, we're stuck. But there's no easy route to reducing consumption.
Mm-hmm. I suppose if we change the way we access the things that we're using to be part of the circular economy, so things like leasing and so forth, then we can reduce our consumption without necessarily sacrificing as much. Jack, do you want to come in on that?
Yes, but it comes back to what I said before. What is the point of our economy? And unless we crack that nut, if we're just going to keep pursuing GDP growth for growth's sake, we can't solve our consumption problem. Even if we make everything so efficient, if my car becomes more efficient, well, I just make a saving of £100. I either spend it driving further or spend it on a holiday to Spain. Doesn't matter, because I'm still earning that money, I'm still going to consume resources. It's just I'm going to consume more because we've made everything efficient. And it's called the Jevons paradox, and it's why the economy is growing so quickly, because it's got more and more efficient. So it's a bit off topic for this, but I think it's so critical that this is discussed. And there's examples of this starting to come through now. So the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, and there's an alliance between Scotland, New Zealand, Iceland, Wales, so small nation governments, but who are looking at not just measuring the economy by GDP, but a whole suite of metrics to see how prosperous and fair and how good a quality of life we have in the country. And once you start moving towards that, it's not a question of do we keep pursuing growth, but what should we grow more of and what should we shrink? Should we grow more cycle lanes so that our daughters can cycle to school, and grow less of something destructive and polluting to meet our well-being? And once we start doing that, I think you start to see our consumption start to come down naturally without sacrificing well-being.
So about having a better understanding of what actually improves our quality of life.
Yeah, what is our economy for? Yeah.
Your question there, I've just got serious deja vu from a cross-engineering institute lecture I attended about 10 years ago, where it was a panel of 6 very senior engineers from the IMechE, the IET, the ICE, the IEEE, and they were all discussing exactly this, the fact that demand will rise constantly to meet the supply that is provided. And one of the members of the panel was talking about how they were an engineering advisor to the government at the time, and had been for years as a fellow of the Institute, and saying that they were advising the government that they need to encourage the population to reduce their demand. Switch off lights when you're not in the room, all of the stuff that we're now, discussing still. And the Chancellor at the time, his response was, okay, so you're telling me to try and convince 60 million people to change how they live and their kind of attitude to electricity, power, whatever, or build 2 new nuclear power stations. As a politician, what do you think my options really are, and what do you think I'm going to do? And this is the same conversation we've been having for 20 years. Mm-hmm. And it's not changing because there's no drive to, well, obviously now we've got the mass protests in the streets over the last year in particular. There seems to be a sudden kind of attitude change that's growing, but unless there's any actual push behind that or these incentives, then it's going to take another 20 years. We'll still be talking about this. Mm-hmm. Whereas, there are examples, there are rural communities that I'm sure you probably deal with, but, in Scotland, the Isle of Egg is a perfect example of a community that's living within its means, and the fact that there's a great documentary online, by the way, community bought out their island and they set up a community energy company with solar panels, wind turbine, backup generators, battery storage. And every household has an amount of energy they can use at any one time. But it is limited. Mm-hmm. But that's just so that they don't blow the network. So they can say, boil a kettle, but they can't use the microwave at the same time, so they just do it one after the other. So they're using their allowed amount of energy within the system boundaries, and everyone has renewable energy, lower bills, and a happy community without over-consuming constantly. Mm-hmm. So it can be done.
Okay, thanks. Should we take one more question from the audience?
Hi, thank you. I hope people can hear me okay through my mask. Okay, great. Thank you. So my name's Claire. I'm with Gaia. Firstly, thank you for this really informative panel. I had a question. Since we've been talking so much about how important it is to reduce extraction by seeing waste as resources, and Lorna, you'd also mentioned having mechanisms like a landfill ban to be able to help incentivize that the circular economy. And so I wanted to see what the panel thought about reducing waste to energy, how to phase out waste energy, seeing as, firstly, it's being seen more increasingly as a climate threat, and that the UNEP itself has said that burning 1 ton of municipal solid waste equals roughly 1 ton of climate emissions. And also that the EU taxonomy has excluded waste energy for this reason, and also seeing that it undermines the move to a circular economy. So I wanted to see what the panel thought about that.
Okay, thanks. I imagine you've got something to say on this, Stuart.
Yeah, I'll pick it up. Yes, we're wasting resources. So we've treated EFW as a transition technology, but you have to accept the fact that the primary purpose of a landfill or a EFW is sanitary. It's getting rid of waste that people are throwing away. So you then have to go to the other end and say, when can we wean people off making residual waste in the first place, and make those changes, those personal changes around that process. At which point, if there's no residual waste, then there is no EFW business. There's no landfill business. So as a transition, yes, we want to decarbonise it. It needs to be balanced against the resource consumption that we want elsewhere in terms of recycling recovery, so it should reduce over time. That's why it's a transition. But today, if we stop doing, and we let you and me pile waste in our backyard, you'll very quickly go to infestations, pollution and other things that come from it. And I think sometimes we forget the sanitary function of the bin man is to remove material that, if left, would cause pestilence, disease and other things. And that transition therefore has to be managed with the consumer behaviour through that process. But prevention, absolutely, if we can stop stuff, and that's ultimately where we need to be as a resource industry.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else?
It was interesting you mentioned the taxonomy, because I was going to say, you know, there's movement. For those of you who don't know what the taxonomy is, it's been developed. Well, there's multiple being developed around the world now, and EU is pretty much the leader in terms of their ambition, and it's basically designed with a list of economic activities that are classed as green, and that's to stop kind of greenwashing. And very specific criteria under those activities you have to meet in order to align with that taxonomy. And then you're forced to disclose, if I'm a big multinational or if I'm an investor or an asset owner, I have to disclose how much of my portfolio is aligned with this taxonomy. So that's the purpose of it. And it's under development in the EU at the moment, and it's got a specific objective on the circular economy. It's the most detailed, it's a 900-page document. I mean, it's outrageous, but there's still a challenge around energy from waste in this taxonomy. It's being challenged right now for the point you make, whether it's a transition activity. So it's not 100% ruled out yet, and that can change in different nation states. Whether you're a country that's burning a lot right now, well, you've got a vested interest to lobby for it to be a transition activity within this taxonomy. So I think it's out for now, which is good, because that'll move the market, even if it is a transition activity. But we'll have to wait and see whether it stays out or whether it's included as a transition activity under the taxonomy.
Great, thanks. We're nearly out of time, so I'm going to ask for some closing statements from the speakers. If you could just keep it to around a minute, that would be great. And as a sort of guiding question, which you don't have to answer, you can choose to say something else, but given there is going to be a new strategy coming out next year in the UK on critical raw materials and resource security, what would you like to see in that strategy?
I'll start.
Mm-hmm.
Proper funding for the resource data hub. One is know what goes in, what comes out, what's in storage. That's the prime one. And then a personal bit, citizen, employee or business responsibility for understanding our role in minimising our use and conservation of. Mm-hmm. If I go back to the externalities, it would be interesting to price up the externality cost of landfill, for example, and then add that and see where that sits with landfill tax, which I suggest would be a lot more than landfill tax in terms of the burden of resources that you're discarding. And I think there's some interesting stuff around value. I'll come back to my kilo of, not my kilo, Scotland's kilo of food to 25,000 bottles. It's a really showstopper in terms of, right, are we focused? We've spent a lot of effort talking about plastics, and actually we've not spent half the time talking about what we do on food, minimising food in the same way, and there's an easy win.
Okay, thank you. Lorna?
Yeah, I think as Stuart said, it's absolutely critical that there is at least some level of understanding of that bigger picture, that resources are not infinite, that they come from somewhere, that they cost, energy and, environmental implications, and that we stop looking at waste as a problem that needs to be buried in the ground and look at it as a revenue of valuable resources that we don't need to be importing from halfway around the other side of the world.
Okay, thanks. Jack?
Yeah, well, I thought if I'm drafting the strategy, it's a no-brainer to aim for what John was saying around demand reduction. It's an absolute no-brainer because UK is so cripplingly reliant on the import of critical materials. So it doesn't make sense to then go down the path of just continually relying on them and trying to match our energy demand, but actually reduce our reliance entirely. So energy demand and material sufficiency, two major prongs in that strategy, should be in there. And then on top of that, we need to think of our impacts on developing countries. So just transition has to be central to that, and whether that's through bilateral trade agreements that we're forming right now from Brexit, or whether it's through more multilateral cooperation and funding, ODA funding, to help the economies that will be impacted by our transition. So I think that should be central to the strategy.
So UK is a responsible global citizen.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. So thanks to all the panellists today for a really great discussion, and thanks to all of you for coming along through the crowds outside. Hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.